This morning we're going to be reading from Exodus chapter 16, verses 2 through 5 and 13 through 31. The whole congregation of the Israelites complained against Moses and Aaron in the wilderness. The Israelites said to them, "If only we had died by the hand of the Lord in the land of Egypt when we sat by the flesh pots and ate our fill of bread. For you have brought us out into this wilderness to kill this whole assembly with hunger." Then the Lord said to Moses, "I'm going to rain down bread from heaven for you, and each day the people shall go out and gather enough for that day. In that way I will test them, whether they will follow my instruction or not. On the sixth day, when they prepare what they bring in, it will be twice as much as they gather on the other days." In the evening, quails came up and covered the camp, and in the morning there was a layer of dew around the camp. When the layer of dew lifted, there on the surface of the wilderness was a fine flaky substance, as fine as frost on the ground. When the Israelites saw it, they said to one another, "What is it?" For they did not know what it was. Moses said to them, "It is the bread that the Lord has given you to eat. This is what the Lord has commanded. Gather as much of it as each of you needs, an omer to a person according to the number of persons, all providing for those in their own tents." The Israelites did so, some gathering more, some gathering less. But when they measured it with an omer, those who gathered much had nothing over, and those who gathered little had no shortage. They gathered as much as each of them needed. And Moses said to them, Let no one leave any of it until morning." But they did not listen to Moses. Some left part of it until morning, and it bred worms and became foul. And Moses was angry with them. Morning by morning they gathered it, as much as each needed. But when the sun grew hot, it melted. On the sixth day they gathered twice as much food, 2 omers apiece. When all the leaders of the congregation came and told Moses, he said to them, "This is what the Lord has commanded. Tomorrow is a day of solemn rest, a holy Sabbath to the Lord. Bake what you want to bake and boil what you want to boil. And all that is left over put aside to be kept until morning." So they put it aside until morning, as Moses commanded them. And it did not become foul, and there were no worms in it. Moses said, "Eat it today, for today is a Sabbath to the Lord. Today you will not find it in the field. 6 days you will gather it, but on the seventh day, when a Sabbath, there will be none." On the seventh day some of the people went out to gather, and they found none. The Lord said to Moses, "How long will you refuse to keep my commandments and instructions? See, the Lord has given you the Sabbath. Therefore on the sixth day he gives you food for 2 days. Each of you stay where you are. Do not leave your place on the seventh day." So the people rested on the seventh day. The house of Israel called it manna. It was like coriander seed, white, and the taste of it was like wafers made with honey. This is the word of God for the people of God. Thanks be to God. Last week we addressed, and in this series we've addressed having enough. The first week we addressed having enough people. We talked about, in Judges 7, Gideon trying to basically thin out the commanders of warriors so that we might realize that God is our ultimate person to depend on. Last week we talked about having enough money, and today we're kind of talking about having enough material things. Though they be valuable, they may not be money in themselves. And we all, I think, can, in a middle class congregation such as this, can identify things that we have in our lives. I know that in the last home that we lived in, we had a 2-car garage, and we could fit 1 car in our 2-car garage because of other things that we had, like, the really valuable stuff, like the riding lawnmower that you paid $200 for. Meanwhile, the $22,000 car sitting in the front driveways, not protected from the crepe myrtles that get rained on and make it terribly awful to clean. Sometimes we live lives like that, though. I mean, we get tired of things that we have, and we want something different. We have a car, we want a truck. We have a truck, we want a car. We have a 3-bedroom house. We want a 4-bedroom house. We have a riding lawnmower. We sometimes want a walk behind or a zero turn. Other times, like in the case of manna with the Israelite people, we have what we need, but we always want something to accessorize it. We want something to make it better. So in other words, we have our necessities, and I guess I wouldn't be too excited about eating manna every single day based on the description that we have in Exodus 16 of what it was like. But we have our necessities, and then we also desire accessories. We're quick to sometimes adorn our accessories, or to adorn our necessities with our accessories. Now, this is being a golf cart community. I see lots of cool golf carts riding around town. Some of you have been gracious enough to allow me to ride and play with you when we play golf or ride around town to whatever events around town. And it doesn't seem to me like you can just kind of go basic. You got to accessorize your golf cart in Calvert City. So if you get a golf cart, you kind of got to get it lifted and make it have cool tires and rims. And that's just kind of the culture that we have that's kind of unique perhaps to Marshall County and Calvert City. I know. Yeah. Thank you. Lots of people do. And we've ridden in some of them, and we're grateful. We sometimes want have a house, and we outgrow that house, and we decide that our life is such that we have to expand beyond what our current limits are within the walls of our boundaries of our home. And this even happens with churches, right? At different events. Maybe tonight might be a case, or at the spaghetti supper, or at the wild game dinner. I'm told that there are certain events that happen in the life of this church where the boundaries are pressed. And we realize we have certain space limitations, and it's hard to host the number of people that we desire to. Well, for the early Israelites, the boundaries that they were trying to press was this God-provided manna. And they had manna, but of course they wanted something to kind of accessorize their diet, to accessorize something that goes beyond this kind of commodity as described in Exodus chapter 16. I want to look at this quote that's offered a long time ago by Dwight D. Eisenhower, and he said something about a different situation that I think is applicable to Exodus chapter 16. He said, some people want champagne and caviar when they should have beer and hot dogs. And so maybe that's a little bit of like what we're talking about in Exodus chapter 16. We might call this this will kind of be a working term today, and we can look at the next slide, this necessity and accessory problem. Trying to delineate between necessities and accessories in our lives. The Hebrew people, probably much like you and I, had on our worst days a necessity and accessory problem. And God told them, I know what you need. That's the necessity. That's what God knew that they needed in order to live and to survive. And yet he also heard what they wanted. And that desire went beyond the necessities of their lives and was expressed in the accessories that they desired beyond just this one staple commodity food. Their necessity was the food that you brought us out into the wilderness. And they explained that we might as well have died in the previous place where we were when we had all the food that we wanted. May I remind you, the place where they previously were was a life of slavery, a life in Egypt in which they did not have the freedom to say what they did with their lives, a life in which they worked every single day of their very lives. And now they were no longer under that hard direction of labor. But they longed to go back to a place that was familiar, even though it was terribly, terribly difficult on them. And so God's reply through this interchange, this conversation that is had between Moses and as representing the Israelite people and God the Father, occurs this way. God said that he would rain bread down from heaven for them. And each day the people would go out and they would gather enough just for that day. But God, being a God who exemplifies a pattern of work with rest, this rhythm of life all the way back from Genesis and the early creation stories, makes room and allows them to have a day of rest, and says on the sixth day they're to gather twice as much food. And whereas all that manna had spoiled days 1 through 5, it would not spoil from day 6 to day 7 when they gathered double as much. And this is similar, if you think about it, what we do in our Open Hearts Food Pantry. When someone comes to the food pantry on the third Monday of a night, they sit down with somebody for this. I think it's really as much for human interaction as anything. To be able to look somebody squarely in the eye and tell them that they matter. And we hear how many people are in their family at that given time. And based on the number of people that are in their family that they're providing for, that determines how much food we give them. Similarly, God did a similar thing with the Israelite people. Based on how many people were in their family, they would get extra food if they needed it, or less if they had less people to provide for. And much like we do in our own lives, we want more. We want some amount beyond what the limits are. Regardless of the limits, we desire to reach beyond what they are. And those Israelite people who were wandering in the wilderness, gathering manna in the wilderness, also wanted more. And when they gathered more, lo and behold, that manna spoiled. God gave them a best-by date, as we talked about earlier. He said, this manna will be good up until the 6th day of the week. But it will be good for 24 hours. And on the 6th day of the week, it will actually be good for 48 hours. And so these are the limits of your collecting. But they went beyond, and that manna spoiled, much to the chagrin of the Israelite people. Some translations call these insects that spoil the manna not just worms, but maggots. And I can think back of a time in my life when, it was pretty recent actually, because I haven't gotten over this. I haven't gotten over my own necessity and accessory problem. We were living in a South Central Tennessee at the time, and we had a washer and dryer and had a full house full of provided goods and fully furnished house that was our stuff that we owned. And we had this really nice laundry room that was nice and big, and you could do all the things that you need to, iron and wash and dry, and had plenty of space. I mean, it was really a nice feature of the home. And in this particular laundry room, we had, I don't remember exactly what washer and dryer we had at the time, but long story short, the washer went out. And so me being the thrifty person that I am, I went to where everybody goes for a washer, Craigslist. And I started looking through the options that were available on Craigslist. And I began to look for a used washer and figure out what we could do to replace our washer that had gone out. And I'd heard of this particular gentleman who refurbished appliances and so forth. And I got an ad confused with this person that I'd heard about. And so I drove about 20 miles north, Beth and I did, and we went to this place called, it was kind of like a thrift store, kind of like a consignment shop, and they just had their appliances on Craigslist. But it was actually a retail business. And so we go back into this kind of sketchy, a little bit shady warehouse and find this array of washers and dryers. And all of them were priced the same, and so we looked and found the one that was the best value for the money and kind of debated, and I was saying, let's just get the used one, we'll save $300-400 on getting a new one. And so we get this washer and we load it up in our truck and somehow get it through our front door and we get it hooked up, and there's a lot more story to it. But we go to wash a load of clothes, and we said, well, before we do that, we want to make sure it runs right? So we hook it up, we run the wash cycle. And whenever the wash cycle is done, we open it up and look down into the wash cycle, and lo and behold, much like the manna in the wilderness had been spoiled by maggots in the wilderness, our washer was spoiled by maggots in the wash bin. Ugh, right? Oh dear. I realize I'm in major trouble. Because I should have just listened to my wife and spent the few $100 extra on this brand new washer, and I would have saved myself a heap of trouble. And I'm not really sure. I'm not really sure. All right. And so I call this guy who's kind of a fix-it-all at our church. And he says, well, did you run the wash cycle a second time? And I was like, not yet, but I just thought I'd call you and see what you thought. And so no clothes had gone in by this time, and I just was appalled to imagine that we had brought foreign insects into our house that were not desired and that we did not want, and it would be the potential downfall of a beautiful marriage. And so we washed with the washer a second time, and we opened up the bin, and guess what? There's maggots, but there's less. And so we washed a third time, and there are no maggots. And we washed a fourth time, and a fifth time, probably a sixth, seventh, eighth time, and there was nothing in there. I guess they'd been flushed out and were gone. And so I don't know how we made it through the next 6 months or so. We actually had that washer, and it cleaned clothes, and we never had anything foreign that was undesirable in our clothes. But that was kind of an example of my own necessity and accessory problem. It wasn't that I needed a washer with all the bells and whistles. My accessory wasn't something fancy that was the top of the line that you could get in a retail store. But my accessory that I desired was extra cash in the bank to not dip into our savings or emergency fund that we had at the time. And, of course, I saved, yes, about $250 by getting a used washer. But I probably would have, and when I thought about this story, I just thought, I don't want to tell this story. Who would, right? But I thought I have to. How many preachers have a good story about maggots that relates to Exodus 16 and manna in the wilderness? I thought, there has to be a reason why God had this happen to us. And I offer it to you. And I probably would have paid you $300 had I not had to tell this story, and thereby been out even more money. But nevertheless, I'm reminded of this other quote from a man named John Trapp. Covetous men, though they have enough to sink them, yet have they never enough to satisfy them. The Hebrew people had a necessity and accessory problem. At times in my life, I have a necessity and accessory problem. And I'm willing to bet that many of you have a necessity and accessory issue. Or if we can look at the next slide, and as we might think of it, an abbreviated NAP. And God's solution to the necessity and accessory problem is more or less in Exodus chapter 16 to relax, to take a day of Sabbath, to take a rest, to take a nap. Do the things, in other words, that are anything unrelated to work. For people who often desire the things that we have, we often pursue the things that we perhaps should not have. And God's answer to this problem, to our necessity and accessory problem, is really to take a nap. In other words, that's an example of the larger issue at stake, to take a Sabbath, to take a day of rest. For all the things that we can do on our Sabbath, some of us may choose to take naps. Some of us may just choose to hit the pause button and not answer email or to answer text or to be connected to the phone at our hip pocket. Some people, such as Eugene Peterson, great Eugene Peterson gave us good examples of what our Sabbath could potentially look like. And he boiled it down to two words. It was pray and it was play. That's an oversimplification, but whatever that amounts to for you is the invitation that Eugene Peterson offered those who would pursue and take a Sabbath. I think in the 21st century, if there's any violation of the Ten Commandments that we're guilty of, it's this one. I think that God really wants us to realize that this is not just a recommendation, but this is something that God actually ordains into the rhythm of our lives, so that we might structure our work week such that we have 6 days of work or 5 days of work or whatever that looks like for you. But we have ideally a 24-hour cycle of the week where we do no work, where we de-stress, where we take a step back. And I know for many of us that means a drastic lifestyle change. And that's okay. We may not be there yet, but I'm offering this suggestion to us this morning. 7 days, the people should harvest what they should have in 6 days. And for those people who were greedy, who extended beyond the boundaries, reached beyond the boundaries that God had set for them, though, much like the washer that was a reminder of how cheap I was, those people gathered manna, but only to watch it spoil in their tents, and how disgusting and foul it must have been. I don't want our reminder of overreaching our bounds to be so foul and disgusting in our lives. This is a lesson that is much easier learned if we follow the pattern that's presented and expected of us, beginning in the Old Testament with Genesis and the story of the coriander seed in Exodus chapter 16. Another quote for us today. There were many, and so I just wanted to share them with you. There's no better antidote against coveting that which is another's than being content with that which is our own. This is a time of season when we are invited to appreciate what we already have. A season in which we are called and invited to be content with the blessings that God's already given us. And we could probably spend hours going through study after study after study that supports this very idea. Now, I'm not talking to you at this point about faith or religion. I'm talking to you about science. Study after study indicates to us that a way for us to be content and whole in our lives is to express gratitude and thanksgiving for the things that we have in our lives. It's scientific. It's proven. And lo and behold, it supports what God calls us to early in God's revelation with us, God's people. The solution to grumbling and complaining is the very essence of thanksgiving and gratitude. If you find yourself in a difficult season of life, ask yourself, what am I giving thanks for on a regular basis? Is thanksgiving an act of a normal rhythm in my life? Do I have a pattern? One of my friends a few years ago had this very simple practice, and at the end of every day, he wrote down 3 good things that happened. And day after day, as he began to do that, he noticed his heart of gratitude being shaped into the heart that God desired. You could enact such a simple principle and perhaps watch your life change. Thanksgiving is, of course, a secular holiday, but before it was ever a secular holiday, it was God's ordained desire for us. We worship, we follow, we learn, we read, we pray. We're inspired, we serve, and we pattern our life after a God who promises us enough for today. And so the next time, perhaps when we face our own NAP, our own necessity and accessory problem, the easiest way to just be content with what we have is just to think about something else. Try to find that neutral ground between where our covetousness would take us and where our current situation currently is. Think about something unrelated. And when we have an NAP problem, it might be time for us to just take the very simple act of taking a nap, have a Sabbath, set aside time when we are occupied less with the things of this world. And so as the band takes their place, I realize this is very difficult for us because this is not the pattern that we're taught in the 21st century. And so what for you in your life would be a way for you to take 1 or 2 steps forward from where you are right now? Perhaps you can answer that. Where in your life would you benefit from hearing God declare to you that this is enough for today? For today, for the days to come. And I hope that through this week, through the chaos of family gatherings and all that is Thanksgiving, I hope that there's a time when you can put on your stretchy pants and get comfortable and take a step back from the world that is. And you can take a nap and remember that that's God's example of a Sabbath that you might begin. It'll allow you to begin anew. Amen.